Welcome to Story Rhyme with Brendan, where I read a story or a poem for you. This time I'll read chapters 8 to 11 of the book called A Complete Account of the Settlement at Port Jackson by Watkin Tench. This book is about the founding years of the Port Jackson settlement. Let's continue.
Chapter 8. Transactions of the colony in the beginning of September 1790. The tremendous monster who had occasioned the unhappy catastrophe just recorded was fated to be the cause of farther mischief to us. September 1790. On the 7th instant, Captain Nepean of the New South Wales Corps and Mr. White, accompanied by a little Nanbury and a party of men, went in a boat to Manly Cove, intending to land there and walk on to Broken Bay. On drawing near the shore, a dead whale, in the most disgusting state of putrefaction, was seen lying on the beach, and at least 200 Indians surrounding it, broiling the flesh on different fires and feasting on it with the most extravagant marks of greediness and rapture. As the boat continued to approach, they were observed to fall into confusion and to pick up their spears, on which our people lay upon their oars, and Nambury, stepping forward, harangued them for some time, assuring them that we were friends. Mr. White now called for Banilon, who, on hearing his name, came forth and entered into conversation. He was greatly emaciated, and so far disfigured by a long beard that our people not without difficulty recognized their old acquaintance. His answering in broken English and inquiring for the governor, however, soon corrected their doubts. He seemed quite friendly, and soon after Colby came up, pointing to his leg, to show that he had freed himself from the fetter which was upon him when he had escaped from us. When Banilon was told that the governor was not far off, he expressed great joy and declared that he would immediately go in search of him, and if he found him not, would follow him to Sydney. "Have you brought any hatchets with you?" cried he. Unluckily, they had not any which they chose to spare, but 2 or 3 shirts, some handkerchiefs, knives, and other trifles were given to them, and seemed to satisfy. Banilon, willing to instruct his countrymen, tried to put on a shirt, but managed it so awkwardly that a man of the name of McIntyre, the governor's gamekeeper, was directed by Mr. White to assist him. This man, who was well known to him, he positively forbade to approach, eyeing him ferociously, and with every mark of horror and resentment. He was, in consequence, left to himself, and the conversation proceeded as before. The length of his beard seemed to annoy him much, and he expressed eager wishes to be shaved, asking repeatedly for a razor. A pair of scissors was given to him, and he showed he had not forgotten how to use such an instrument, for he forthwith began to clip his hair with it. During this time the women and children, to the number of more than 50, stood at a distance and refused all invitations, which could be conveyed by signs and gestures, to approach nearer. "Which of them is your old favourite, Barangaroo, of whom you used to speak so often?" "Oh," said he, "she has become the wife of Colby, but I have got Bulla, Murli, Dian, 2 large women, to compensate for her loss." September 1790. It was observed that he had received 2 wounds, in addition to his former numerous ones, since he had left us. One of them from a spear, which had passed through the fleshy part of his arm, and the other displayed itself in a large scar above his left eye. They were both healed, and probably well acquired in the conflict wherein he had asserted his pretensions to the 2 ladies. Nambury, all this while, though, he continued to interrogate his countrymen and to interpret on both sides, showed little desire to return to their society, and stuck very close to his new friends. On being asked the cause of their present meeting, Banilon pointed to the whale, which stunk immoderately, and Colby made signals that it was common among them to eat until the stomachs were so overladen as to occasion sickness. Their demand of hatchets being reiterated, notwithstanding our refusal, they were asked why they had not brought with them some of their own. They excused themselves by saying that on an occasion of the present sort they always left them at home, and cut up the whale with the shell which is affixed to the end of the throwing stick. Our party now thought it time to proceed on their original expedition, and having taken leave of their stable friends, rowed to some distance where they landed, and set out for Broken Bay, ordering the coxswain of the boat, that's the driver of a lifeboat, a small boat, in which they had come down, to go immediately and acquaint the governor of all that had passed. When the natives saw that the boat was about to depart, they crowded around her and brought down, by way of present, 3 or 4 great junks of the whale, and put them on board of her, the largest of which Banyalong expressly requested might be offered in his name to the governor. It happened that His Excellency had this day gone to a landmark, which was building on the south head, near the flagstaff, to serve as a direction to the ships at sea, and the boat met him on his return to Sydney. Immediately on receiving the intelligence, he hastened back to the south head, and having procured all the firearms which could be mustered there, consisting of 4 muskets and a pistol, set out attended by Mr. Collins and Lieutenant Waterhouse of the Navy. September 1790. When the boat reached Manly Cove, the natives were found still busily employed around the whale, as they expressed not any consternation on seeing us row to the beach. Governor Phillip stepped out unarmed, and attended by 1 seaman only, and called for Banyalong, who appeared, but notwithstanding his former eagerness, would not suffer the other to approach him for several minutes. Gradually, however, he warmed into friendship and frankness, and presently after Colby came up. They discoursed for some time, Banyalong expressing pleasure to see his old acquaintance, and inquiring by name for every person whom he could recollect at Sydney, and among others for a French cook, one of the governor's servants, whom he had constantly made the butt of his ridicule by mimicking his voice, gait, and other peculiarities, all of which he again went through with his wonted exactness and drollery. He asked also particularly for a lady from whom he had once ventured to snatch a kiss, and on being told that she was well, by way of proving that the token was fresh in his remembrance, he kissed Lieutenant Waterhouse and laughed aloud. On his wounds being noticed, he coldly said that he had received them at Botany Bay, but went no farther into their history. September 1790. Hatchets still continued to be called for with redoubled eagerness, which rather surprised us, as formerly they had always been accepted with indifference. But Banyalong had probably demonstrated to them their superiority over those of their own manufacturing. To appease their importunity, the governor gave them a knife, some bread, pork, and other articles, and promised that in 2 days he would return hither and bring with him hatchets to be distributed among them, which appeared to diffuse general satisfaction. Banyalong's love of wine had been mentioned, and the governor, to try whether it still subsisted, uncorked a bottle and poured out a glass of it, which the other drank off with his former marks of relish and good humour, giving for a toast, as he had been taught, the king. Our party now advanced from the beach, but perceiving many of the Indians filing off to the right and left, so as in some measure to surround them, they retreated gently to their old situation, which produced neither alarm or offence. The others by degrees also resumed their former position, a very fine barbed spear of uncommon size being seen by the governor. He asked for it, but Banyalong, instead of complying with the request, took it away, and laid it some distance, and brought back a throwing stick, which he presented to His Excellency. Matters had proceeded in this friendly train for more than half an hour, when a native with a spear in his hand came forward, and stopped at a distance of between 20 and 30 yards, 18 to 27 metres, from the place where the governor, Mr. Collins, Lieutenant Waterhouse, and a seaman stood. His Excellency held out his hand and called to him, advancing towards him at the same time. Mr. Collins followed close behind. He appeared to be a man of middle age, short of stature, sturdy, and well set, seemingly a stranger, and but little acquainted with Banyalong and Colby. The nearer the governor approached, the greater became the terror and agitation of the Indian. Governor Phillip threw down a dirk, which he wore at his side. The other, alarmed at the rattle of the dirk and probably misconstruing the action, instantly fixed his lance to his throwing stick. Side note: such preparation is equal to what cocking a gun and directing it at its object would be with us. To launch the spear or to touch the trigger only remains. To retreat, His Excellency now thought would be more dangerous than to advance. He therefore cried out to the man, "Weary, weary! Bad, you are doing wrong," displaying at the same time every token of amity and confidence. The words had, however, hardly gone forth when the Indian, stepping back with one foot, aimed his lance with such force and dexterity that, striking the governor's right shoulder, just above the collarbone, the point, glancing downward, came out at his back, having made a wound of many inches long. A side note: His Excellency described the shock to me as similar to a violent blow, with such energy as the weapon thrown. Back to the main text. The man was observed to keep his eye steadily fixed on the lance until it struck its object, when he directly dashed into the woods and was seen no more. Instant confusion on both sides took place. Benelon and Colby disappeared, and several spears were thrown from different quarters, though without effect. A party retreated as fast as they could, calling to those who were left in the boat to hasten up with firearms. The situation, more distressing than that of the governor during the time that this lasted, cannot readily be conceived. The pole of the spear, not less than 10 feet in length, that's about 3 meters, sticking out before him and impeding his flight, the butt frequently striking the ground and lacerating the wound. In vain did Mr. Waterhouse try to break it, and the barb, which appeared on the other side, forbade extraction, until that could be performed. At length it was broken, and His Excellency reached the boat, by which time the seamen with the muskets had got up, and were endeavouring to fire them. But one only would go off, and there is no room to believe that it was attended with any execution. When the governor got home, the wound was examined. It had bled a good deal in the boat, and it was doubted whether the subclavian artery might not be divided. On moving the spear, it was found, however, that it might be safely extracted, which was accordingly performed. Apprehension for the safety of the party who had gone to Broken Bay now took place. Lieutenant Long, with a detachment of Marines, was immediately sent to escort them back, lest any ambush might be laid by the natives to cut them off. When Mr. Long reached Manly Cove, the sun had set. However, he pursued his way in the dark, scrambling over rocks and thickets, as well as he could, until 2 o'clock on the following morning, when he overtook them at a place where they had halted to sleep, about halfway between the two harbours. At daybreak they all returned, and were surprised to find tracks in the sand of the feet of the Indians, almost the whole way from the place where they had slept to the cove. By this it should seem as if these last had secretly followed them, probably with hostile intentions, but on discovering their strength and that they were on their guard, had abandoned their design. On reaching Manly Cove, 3 Indians were observed standing on a rock, with whom they entered into conversation. The Indians informed them that the man who had wounded the governor belonged to a tribe residing at Broken Bay, and they seemed highly to condemn what he had done. Our gentleman asked them for a spear, which they immediately gave. The boat's crew said that Benelon and Colby had just departed, after a friendly intercourse. Like the others, they had pretended highly to disapprove the conduct of the man who had thrown the spear, vowing to execute vengeance upon him. September 1790. From this time until the 14th, no communication passed between the natives and us. On that day, the chaplain and Lieutenant Dawes, having Abaroo with them in a boat, learned from 2 Indians that Willie Murrin was the name of the person who had wounded the governor. These 2 people inquired kindly how His Excellency did, and seemed pleased to hear that he was likely to recover. They said that they were inhabitants of Rose Hill, and expressed great dissatisfaction at the number of white men who had settled in their former territories, in consequence of which declaration the detachment at that post was reinforced on the following day. September 1790. A hazardous enterprise. But when liberty is the stake, what enterprise is too hazardous for its attainment? Was undertaken in this month by 5 convicts at Rose Hill, who in the night seized a small punt there and proceeded in her to the South Head, whence they seized and carried off a boat, appropriated to the use of the lookout house, and put to sea in her, doubtless with a view of reaching any port they could arrive at, and asserting their freedom. They had all come out in the last fleet, and for some time previous to their elopement had been collecting fishing tackle and hoarding up provisions, to enable them to put their scheme into execution. A side note. They have never since been heard of. Before they went away, they tried in vain to procure firearms. If they were not swallowed by the sea, probably they were cut off by the natives, on some part of the coast where their necessities obliged them to land. Chapter 9. Transactions of the colony in part of September and October 1790. September 1790. From so unfavourable an omen as I have just related, who could prognosticate that an intercourse with the natives was about to commence? That the foundation of what neither entreaty, munificence, or humanity could induce should be laid by a deed which threatened to accumulate scenes of bloodshed and horror was a consequence which neither speculation could predict or hope expect to see accomplished. On the 15th, a fire being seen on the north shore of the harbour, a party of our people went thither, accompanied by Nanbury and Abaru. They found where Banilon and several other natives, and much civility passed, which was cemented by a mutual promise to meet in the afternoon at the same place. Both sides were punctual to their engagement, and no objection being made to our landing, a party of us went ashore to them unharmed. Several little presents, which had been purposely brought, were distributed among them, and to Banilon were given a hatchet and a fish. At a distance stood some children, who, though at first timorous and unwilling to approach, were soon persuaded to advance and join the men. A bottle of wine was produced, and Banilon immediately prepared for the charge. Bread and beef he called loudly for, which were given to him, and he began to eat, offering a part of his fare to his countrymen, 2 of whom tasted the beef, but none of them would touch the bread. Having finished his repast, he made a motion to be shaved, and a barber being present, his request was complied with, to the great admiration of his countrymen, who laughed and exclaimed at the operation. They would not, however, consent to undergo it, but suffered their beards to be clipped with a pair of scissors. On being asked where their women were, they pointed to the spot, but seemed not desirous that we should approach it. However, in a few minutes, a female appeared not far off, and Abaru was dispatched to her. Banilon now joined with Abaru to persuade her to come to us, telling us she was Barangaroo and his wife, notwithstanding he had so lately pretended that she had left him for Colby. At length she yielded, and Abaru, having first put a petticoat on her, brought her to us. But this was the prudery of the wilderness, which her husband joined us to ridicule, and we soon laughed her out of it. The petticoat was dropped with hesitation, and Barangaroo stood, armed cap a pee in nakedness. At the request of Banilon, we combed and cut her hair, and she seemed pleased with the operation. Wine she would not taste, but turned from it with disgust, though heartily invited to drink by the example and persuasion of Banilon. In short, she behaved so well and assumed the character of gentleness and timidity to such advantage that had our acquaintance ended here, a very moderate share of the spirit of travelling would have sufficed to record that amidst a horde of roaming savages in the desert wastes of New South Wales might be found as much feminine innocence, softness and modesty, allowing for inevitable difference of education, as the most finished system could bestow, or the most polished circle produce. So little fitted are we to judge of human nature at once, and yet on such grounds have countries been described, and nations characterized. Hence have arisen those speculative and laborious compositions on the advantages and superiority of a state of nature. But to resume my subject. September 1790. Supposing that by a private conversation she might be induced to visit Sydney, which would be the means of drawing her husband and others thither. Abaru was instructed to take her aside and try if she could persuade her to comply with our wish. They wandered away together accordingly, but it was soon seen that Bangaru's arguments to induce Abaru to rejoin their society were more powerful than those of the latter to prevail upon her to come among us, for it was not without manifest reluctance and often repeated injunctions that Abaru would quit her countrywoman, and when she had done so, she sat in the boat in sullen silence, evidently occupied by reflection on the scene she had left behind, and returning inclination to her former habits of life. Nor was a circumstance which had happened in the morning interview perhaps wholly unremembered by the girl. We had hinted to Banilon to provide a husband for her, who should be at liberty to pass and repass to and from Sydney, as he might choose. There was at the time a slender fine-looking youth in company, called Im-i-ra-wan-yi, about 16 years old. The lad, on being invited, came immediately up to her, and offered many blandishments, which proved that he had assumed the toga virilis, a man's gown. But Abaru disclaimed his advances, repeating the name of another person, who we knew was her favourite. The young lover was not, however, easily repulsed, but renewed his suit on our return in the afternoon with such warmth and solicitation as to cause an evident alteration in the sentiments of the lady. To heighten the good humour which pervaded both parties, we began to play and romp with them. Feats of bodily strength were tried, and their inferiority was glaring. One of our party lifted with ease 2 of them from the ground, in spite of their efforts to prevent him, whereas in return no one of them could move him. They called him Muri Mula, the large strong man. Compared with our English labourers, their muscular power would appear very feeble and inadequate. Before we parted, Banilon informed us that his countrymen had lately been plundered of fish gigs, spears, a sword, and many other articles by some of our people, and expressed a wish that they should be restored, promising that if they were, the governor's dirk should be produced and returned to us tomorrow if we would meet him here. September 1790. Accordingly, on the following day, we rode to the spot, carrying with us the stolen property. We found here several natives, but not Banilon. We asked for him, and were told that he was gone down the harbour with Barangaroo to fish. Although disappointed at his breach of promise, we went on shore and mingled without distrust among those we found, acquainting them that we had brought with us the articles of which they had been plundered. On hearing this account, they expressed great joy, and Imi-Rawanyi, darting forward, claimed the sword. It was given to him, and he had no sooner grasped it than he hastened to convince his mistress that his prowess in war was not inferior to his skill in courtship. Singling out a yellow gum tree for the foe, he attacked it with great fierceness, calling to us to look on, and accompanying his onset with all the gestures and vociferation which they use in battle. Having conquered his enemy, he laid aside his fighting face, and joined us with a countenance which carried in it every mark of youth and good nature. Whether Abaru's coyness and preference for another had displeased him, or it was owing to natural fickleness, he paid her no further interest, but seemed more delighted with us. He had no beard, but was highly gratified in being combed and having his hair clipped. All the stolen property being brought on shore, an old man came up and claimed one of the fish gigs, singling it from the bundle and taking only his own, and this honesty within the circle of their society seemed to characterize them all. September 1790. During this time it was observed that one of the Indians, instead of mixing with the rest, stood aloof, in a musing posture, contemplating what passed. When we offered to approach him, he shunned us not, and willingly shook hands with all who chose to do so. He seemed to be between 30 and 40 years old, was jolly, and had a thoughtful countenance, much marked by the smallpox. He wore a string of bits of dried reed round his neck, which I asked him to exchange for a black stock. He smiled at the proposal, but made no offer of what I wanted, which our young friend, Imirawenyi, observing, flew to him, and taking off the necklace, directly fixed it about my neck. I feared he would be enraged, but he bore it with serenity, and suffered a gentleman present to fasten his black stock upon him, with which he appeared to be pleased. To increase his satisfaction, some other trifle was given to him. A stock is a old-style bow tie. It's got a hook on the back that connects. Having remained here an hour, we went in quest to Banilon, agreeably to the directions which his companions pointed out. We found him in Barangaroo, shivering over a few lighted sticks, but which they were dressing small fish, and their canoe hauled up on the beach near them. On first seeing the boat, they ran into the woods, but on being called by name, they came back and consented to our landing. We carried on shore with us the remaining part of the fish gigs and spears which had been stolen, and restored them to Banilon. Among other things was a net full of fishing lines, and other tackle, which Barangaroo said was her property, and immediately on receiving it, she slung it around her neck. Banilon inquired with solicitude about the state of the governor's wound, but he made no offer of restoring the dirk, and when he was asked for it, he pretended to know nothing of it, changing the conversation with great art and asking for wine, which was given to him. At parting, we pressed him to appoint a day on which he should come to Sydney, assuring him that he would be well received and kindly treated. Doubtful, however, of being permitted to return, he evaded our request and declared that the governor must first come and see him, which we promised should be done. The governor did not hesitate to execute the engagement, which we had contracted for him, but Banilon still resisted coming among us, and matters continued in this fluctuating state until the 8th of October, when a fire, which they had agreed to light as a signal for us to visit them, was observed. The eager desire by which we were stimulated to carry our point of effecting an intercourse has appeared. Various parties accordingly set out to meet them, provided with different articles which we thought would prove acceptable to them. We found assembled Banilon, Barangaroo, and another young woman, and 6 men, all of whom received us with welcome, except the grave-looking gentleman before-mentioned, who stood aloof in his former musing posture. When they saw that we had brought hatchets and other articles with us, they produced spears, fish gigs, and lines for the purpose of barter. Side note: it had long been our wish to establish a commerce of this sort. It is a painful consideration that every previous addition to the cabinet of the virtuosi from this country had wrung a tear from the plundered Indian, which immediately commenced to the satisfaction of both parties. I had brought with me an old blunted spear, which wanted repair. An Indian immediately undertook to perform the task, and carrying it to a fire, tore with his teeth a piece of bone from a fish gig, which he fastened on the spear with yellow gum, rendering flexible by heat. October 1790. Many of them now consented to be shaved by a barber whom we had purposely brought over. As I thought he who could perform an operation of such importance must be deemed by them an eminent personage, I bade him ask one of them for a fine barbed spear which he held in his hand. But all the barber's eloquence was wasted on the Indian, who plainly gave him to understand that he meant not to part with his spear without receiving an equivalent. Unfortunately, his price was a hatchet, and the only one which I had brought with me was already disposed of to the man who had pointed my spear. In vain did I tempt him with a knife, a handkerchief, and a hat. Nothing but a hatchet seemed to be regarded. Bulamogo Barabugo, 2 hatchets tomorrow, I repeatedly cried, but having probably experienced our insincerity, he rejected the proposal with disdain. Finding him inflexible and longing to possess the spear, I told him at length that I would go to Sydney and fetch what he required. This seemed to satisfy, and he accompanied me to my boat, in which I went away, and as quickly as possible procured what was necessary to conclude the bargain. On my return, I was surprised to see all our boats rowing towards home, and with them a canoe, in which sat 2 Indians paddling. I pulled to them and found that Bennylong and another Indian were in one of the boats, and that the whole formed a party going over to visit the governor. I now learned that during my absence, the governor had passed in a boat on his return from Rose Hill, near the place where they were standing, and that finding he would not come to them, although they had called to him to do so, they had at once determined to venture themselves unreservedly among us. One of the men in the canoe was the person to whom I was to give the hatchet I had been to fetch, and directly as he saw me, he held up his spear, and the exchange took place, with which, and perhaps to reward me for the trouble I had taken, he was so delighted, that he presented me with a throwing stick, gratis, thrown in for free. October 1790. Not seeing Barangaroo of the party, I asked for her, and was informed that she had violently opposed Bennylong's departure. When she found persuasion vain, she had recourse to tears, scolding and threats, stamping the ground and tearing her hair. But Bennylong continuing determined, she snatched up in her rage one of his fish gigs, and dashed it with such fury on the rocks that it broke. To quiet her apprehensions on the score of her husband's safety, Mr. Johnson, attended by our Baroo, agreed to remain as a hostage until Bennylong should return. We landed our 4 friends opposite the hospital, and set out for the governor's house. On hearing of their arrival, such numbers flocked to view them, that we were apprehensive the crowd of persons would alarm them, but they had left their fears behind, and marched on with boldness and unconcern. When we reached the governor's house, Bennylong expressed honest joy to see his old friend, and appeared pleased to find that he had recovered of his wound. The governor asked for Willie Marin, and they said he was a broken bay. Some bread and beef were distributed among them, but unluckily no fish had to be procured, which we were sorry for, as a promise of it had been one of the leading temptations by which they had been allured over. A hatchet apiece was however given to them, and a couple of petticoats, and some fishing tackle sent for Barangaroo and the other women. The ceremony of introduction being finished, Bennylong seemed to consider himself quite at home, running from room to room with his companions, and introducing to his old friends the domestics in the most familiar manner. Among these last he particularly distinguished the governor's orderly sergeant, whom he kissed with great affection, and a woman who attended in the kitchen, but the gamekeeper, McIntyre, he continued to hold in abhorrence, and would not suffer his approach. A side note, look at the account of the governor's being wounded, when his detestation of this man burst forth. Back to the main text. October 1790. Nor was his importance to his countrymen less conspicuous in other respects. He undertook to explain the use and nature of those things which were new to them. Some of his explanations were whimsical enough, seeing, for instance, a pair of snuffers. He told them that they were nuffer for candle. Side note. The S is a letter which they cannot pronounce, having no sound in their language similar to it. When bidden to pronounce sun, they always say ton, salt, tolt, and so of all words wherein it occurs. Back to the main text. Nuffer for candle, which the others not comprehending, he opened the snuffers, and holding up the forefinger of his left hand to represent a candle, made the motion of snuffing it. Finding that even this sagacious interpretation failed, he threw down the snuffers in a rage, and reproaching their stupidity walked away. It was observed that a soft, gentle tone of voice, which we had taught him to use, was forgotten. His native vociferation returned in full force. Pronunciation, I guess. But the tenderness which, like Arabanu, he had always manifested to children, he still retained, as appeared by his behaviour to those who were presented to him. October 1790. The first wish they expressed to return was compiled with, in order to banish all appearance of constraint, the party who had conducted them to Sydney returning with them. When we reached the opposite shore, we found Abaru and the other women fishing in a canoe, and Mr. Johnson and Barangaroo sitting at the fire, the latter employed in manufacturing fishing hooks. At a little distance on an adjoining eminence sat an Indian, with his spear in his hand, as if sentinel over the hostages, for the security of his countrymen's return. During our absence, Barangaroo had never ceased whining and reproaching her husband. Now that he was returned, she met him with unconcern and seemed intent on her work only. But this state of repose did not long continue. Bennelong, eyeing the broken fish gag, cast at her a look of savage fury and began to interrogate her, and it seemed more than probable that the remaining part would be demolished about her head, had we not interposed to pacify him. Nor would we quit the place until his forgiveness was complete, and his good humour restored. No sooner, however, did she find her husband's rage subsided, than her hour of triumph commenced. The alarm and trepidation she had manifested disappeared. Elated at his condescension, and emboldened by our presence, and the finery in which we had decked her, she in turn assumed a haughty demeanour, refused to answer his caresses, and viewed him with a reproaching eye. Although long absence from female society had somewhat blunted our recollection, the conduct of Barangaroo did not appear quite novel to us, nor was our surprise very violent at finding that it succeeded in subduing Bennelong, who, when we parted, seemed anxious only to please her. Thus ended a day, the events of which served to complete what an unhappy accident had begun. From this time our intercourse with the natives, though particularly interrupted, was never broken off. We gradually continued henceforth to gain knowledge of their customs and policy, the only knowledge which can lead to a just estimate of national character. Chapter 10. The arrival of the supply from Batavia, the state of the colony, in November 1790. Joy sparkled in every countenance to see our old friend the supply. I hope no reader will be so capacious as to quarrel with the phrase. Enter the harbour from Batavia on the 19th of October. We had witnessed her departure with tears. We hailed her return with transport. Captain Ball was rather more than 6 months in making this voyage, and is the first person who ever circumnavigated the continent of New Holland. On his passage to Batavia, he had discovered several islands, which he gave names to, and after fighting his way against adverse elements and through unexplored dangers, safely reached his destined port. He had well stored his little bark with every necessary and conveniency, which he judged we should first want, leaving a cargo of rice and salt provisions to be brought on by a Dutch snow. I think that's a snow shovel, which he had hired and freighted for the use of the settlement. While at Batavia, the supply had lost many of her people by sickness, and left several others in the general hospital at that place. As the arrival of the supply naturally leads to the attention from other subjects to the state of the colony, I shall here take a review of it by transcribing a statement drawn from the actual observation soon after, exactly as I find it written in my journal. November 1790. Cultivation on a public scale has for some time past been given up here, Sydney, the crop of last year being so miserable as to deter from further experiment, in consequence of which the government farm is abandoned, and the people who were fixed on it have been removed. Necessary public buildings advance fast. An excellent storehouse of large dimensions, built of bricks and covered with tiles, is just completed, and another planned, which will shortly be begun. Other buildings, among which I heard the governor mention a hospital and permanent barracks for the troops, may also be expected to arise soon. Works of this nature are more expeditiously performed than heretofore, owing, I apprehend, to the superintendents lately arrived, who are placed over the convicts and compel them to labour. The first difficulties of a new country being subdued may also contribute to this comparative facility. Vegetables are scarce, although the summer is so far advanced owing to want of rain. I do not think that all the showers of the last 4 months put together would make 24 hours rain. Our farms, what with this and a poor soil, are in wretched condition. My winter crop of potatoes, which I planted in days of despair, March and April last, turned out very badly when I dug them up about 2 months back. Wheat returned so poorly last harvest that very little besides Indian corn has been sown this year. The governor's wound is quite healed, and he feels no inconveniency whatever from it. With the natives we are hand and glove. They throng the camp every day, and sometimes by their clamour and importunity have bread and meat, of which they now all eat greedily, are becoming very troublesome. God knows we have little enough for ourselves. Full allowance, if 8 pounds of flour and either 7 pounds of beef or 4 pounds of pork, served alternatively per week, without either pause, oatmeal, spirits, butter, or cheese, can be called so, is yet to keep up. But if the Dutch snow does not arrive soon, it must be shortened, as the casks in the storehouse, I observed yesterday, are woefully decreased. The convicts continue to behave pretty well. 3 only have been hanged since the arrival of the last fleet, in the latter end of June, all of whom were newcomers. The number of convicts here diminishes every day, our principal efforts being wisely made at Rose Hill, where the land is unquestionably better than about this place. Except building, sawing, and brick-making, nothing of consequence is now carried on here. The account which I received a few days ago from the brickmakers of their labours was as follows. Wheeler, one of the master brickmakers, with 2 tile stools and 1 brick stool, was tasked to make and burn ready for use 30,000 tiles and bricks per month. He had 21 hands to assist him, who performed everything, cut wood, dug clay, etc. This continued during the days of distress excepted, when they did what they could, until June last. From June, with 1 brick and 2 tile stools, he has been tasked to make 40,000 bricks and tiles monthly, as many of each sort as may be, having 22 men and 2 boys to assist him, on the same terms of procuring materials as before. They fetch the clay of which tiles are made, 200 yards, that for bricks is close at hand. He says that the bricks are such as would be called in England moderately good, and he judges they would have fetched about 24 shillings per thousand. It's about £1.2, or about $500 today. At Kingston upon Thames, where he resided in the year 1784, the greatest fault is being too brittle. The tiles he thinks not so good as those made about London. The stuff has a rotten quality, and besides, wants the advantages of being ground, in lieu of which they tread it. November 1790. King, another master bricklayer, last year, with the assistance of 16 men and 2 boys, made 11,000 sand bricks weekly, with 2 stools. During short allowance, did what he could, resumed his old task, when put again on full allowance, and had his number of assistants augmented to 20 men and 2 boys, on account of the increased distance of carrying wood for the kilns. He worked at Hammersmith for Mr. Scott of that place. He thinks the bricks made here as good as those made near London, and says that in the year 1784 they would have sold for £1 per thousand. That's about $200 Australian. And to have picked the kiln at 30 shillings. That's about $560 Australian today. Such is my Sydney detail, dated on the 12th of November, 1790, 4 days after I went to Rose Hill, and wrote there the subjoined remarks. November 16th. Got to Rose Hill in the evening. Next morning walked round the whole of the cleared and cultivated land with the Reverend Mr. Johnson, who is the best farmer in the country. Edward Dodd, one of the governor's household, who conducts everything here in the agricultural line, accompanied us part of the way and afforded all the information he could. He estimates the quantity of cleared and cultivated land at 200 acres. Of these, 55 are in the wheat, barley, and a little oats, 30 in maize, corn, and the remainder is either just cleared of wood or is occupied by buildings, gardens, etc. 4 enclosures of 20 acres each are planned for the reception of cattle, which may arrive in the colony, and 2 of these are already fenced in. In the centre of them is to be erected a house for a person who will be fixed upon to take care of the cattle. All these enclosures are supplied with water, and only a part of the trees which grew in them being cut down gives to them a very park-like and beautiful appearance. Our survey commenced on the north side of the river. Dodd says he expects this year's crop of wheat and barley from the 55 acres to yield full 400 bushels. A bushel is about 36 litres, so it's about 1.5 kitchen sinks worth full. So 400 bushels is about 48 bathtubs full. Appearances hitherto hardly indicate so much. He says he finds the beginning of May the best time to sow barley. As a side note, the best crop of barley ever produced in New South Wales was sown by a private individual in February 1790 and reaped in the following October. Back to the main text. But that in May continued to be sown until August. That sown in May is reaped in December, that of August in January. He sowed his wheat part in June and part in July. He thinks June the best time, and says that he invariably finds that which is deepest sown grows strongest and best. Even as deep as 3 inches he has put it in and found it to answer. The wheat sown in June is now turning yellow. That of July is more backward. He has used only the broadcast husbandry and sowed 2 bushels per acre. The plough has never yet been tried here. All the ground is hoed, and, as Dodd confesses, very incompetently turned up. Each convict labourer was obliged to hoe 16 rods a day, so that in some places the earth was but just scratched over. The ground was left open for some months to receive benefit from the sun and air, and on that newly cleared the trees were burnt, and the ashes dug in. I do not find that a succession of crops has yet been attempted. Surely it would help to ameliorate and improve the soil. Dodd recommends strongly the culture of potatoes on a large scale and says that where they planted, even as late as January, they would answer. But this I doubt. He is more than ever of opinion that without a large supply of cattle, nothing can be done. They have not at this time either horse, cow, or sheep here. I asked him how the stock they had was coming on. The fowls, he said, multiplied exceedingly, but the hogs neither thrived or increased in number for want of food. He pointed out to us his best wheat, which looks tolerable and may perhaps yield 13 or 14 bushels per acre, 1.7 bathtubs. Side note, as all the trees on our cleared ground were cut down and not grubbed up, the roots and stumps remain, on which account a 10th part of surface in every acre must be deducted. This is slovenly husbandry, but in a country where immediate subsistence is wanted, it is perhaps necessary. None of these stumps, when I left Port Jackson, showed any symptoms of decay, though some of the trees had been cut down 4 years. To the different qualities of the wood of Norfolk Island and New South Wales, perhaps the difference of soil may in some measure be traced. That of Norfolk Island is light and porous. It rots and turns into mould in 2 years. Besides its hardness, that of Port Jackson abounds with red corrosive gum, which contributes its share of mischief. Next came the oats, which are in ear, though not more than 6 inches high, 15 centimetres. They will not return as much seed as was sown. The barley, except one patch in a corner of a field, little better than the oats. Crossed the river and inspected the south side. Found a little patch of wheat at the bottom of the crescent very bad. Proceeded and examined the large field on the ascent to the westward. Here are about 25 acres of wheat, which from its appearance we guessed would produce perhaps 7 bushels an acre. The next patch to this is in maize corn, which looks not unpromising. Some of the stems are stout and beginning to throw out large broad leaves, the surest sign of vigour. The view from the top of the wheat field takes in, except a narrow slip, the whole of the cleared land at Rose Hill. From not having before seen an opening of such extent for the last 3 years, this struck us as grand and capacious. The beautiful diversity of the ground, gentle hill and dale, would clearly be reckoned pretty in any country. Continued our walk and crossed the old field, which is intended to form part of the main street of the projected town. The wheat in this field is rather better, but not much, than in the large field before mentioned. The next field is maize, inferior to what we have seen, but not despicable. An acre of maize at the bottom of the marine garden is equal in luxuriancy of promise to any I have ever saw in any country. The main street of the new town is already begun. It is to be a mile long, and of such breadth as will make Pall Mall and Portland Place hide their diminished heads. It contains at present 32 houses completed, and 24 feet by 12 each, about 7 by 3.5 metres, on the ground floor only, built of wattles, plastered with clay and thatched. Each house is divided into 2 rooms, in one of which is a fireplace and a brick chimney. These houses are designed for men only, and 10 is the number of inhabitants allotted to each, but some of them now contain 12 or 14, for want of better accommodation. More a building in a cross street stand 9 houses for unmarried women, and exclusive of all these are several small huts where convict families of good character are allowed to reside. Of public buildings, besides the old wooden barrack and store, there is a house of lath and plaster, 44 feet long and 16 wide. It's about 13 by 5 metres. For the governor, on a ground floor only, with excellent outhouses and appurtenances attached to it. A new brick storehouse, covered with tiles, 100 feet long and 24 wide, 30 metres by 7 metres, is nearly completed, and a house for the storekeeper. The first stone of a barrack, 100 feet long and 24 wide, that's 30 and 7 metres again, to which are intended to be added wings for the officers, was laid today. The situation of the barrack is judicious, being close to the storehouse and within 150 yards of the wharf, where all boats from Sydney unload. To what I have already enumerated must be added an excellent barn, a granary, an enclosed yard to rear stock in, a commodious blacksmith's shop, and a most wretched hospital, totally destitute of every conveniency. Luckily for the gentleman who superintends this hospital, and still more luckily for those who are doomed in case of sickness to enter it, the air of Rose Hill is hitherto being generally healthy. The air of Rose Hill has hitherto been generally healthy. A tendency to produce slight inflammatory disorders from the rapid changes of the temperature of the air is most to be dreaded. Side note. In the close of the year 1788, when this settlement was established, the thermometer has been known to stand at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius, a little before sunrise, and between 1 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon at about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that's about 38 degrees Celsius. The hours of labour for the convicts are the same here as at Sydney. On Saturdays after 10 o'clock in the morning, they are allowed to work in their own gardens. These gardens are at present, from the long drought and other causes, in a most deplorable state. Potatoes, I think, thrive better than any other vegetable in them. For the public conveniency, a baker is established here in a good bakehouse, who exchanges with every person bread for flour on stipulated terms, but no compulsion exists for anyone to take his bread. It is left entirely to everybody's own option to consume his flour as he pleases. Divine service is performed here morning and afternoon, one Sunday in every month, when all the convicts are obliged to attend church under penalty of having a part of their allowance of provisions stopped, which is done by the chaplain, who is a justice of the peace. For the punishment of offenders, where a criminal court is not judged necessary, 2 or more justices occasionally assembled and ordered the infliction of slight corporal punishment or short confinement in a strong room built for this purpose. The military present here consists of 2 subalterns, that's 2 officers under the rank of captain, 2 sergeants, 3 corporals, and a drummer, and 21 privates. These have been occasionally augmented and reduced as circumstances have been thought to render it necessary. Brick kilns are now erected here, and bricks manufactured by a convict of the name of Beckett, who came out in the last fleet, and has 52 people to work under him. He makes 25,000 bricks weekly. He says that they are very good and would sell at Birmingham, where he worked about 18 months ago, at more than 30 shillings per thousand, so 560 Australian dollars today. Nothing farther of public nature remaining to examine, I next visited a humble adventurer who was trying his fortune here. James Roos, convict, was cast for 7 years at Bodmin Assizes. And Assizes is a court of law that travelled to each county of England and Wales. In August 1782, he lay 5 years in prison and on board the Dunkirk hulk at Plymouth, and then was sent to this country. When his term of punishment expired in August 1789, he claimed his freedom and was permitted by the governor, on promising to settle in the country, to take in December following an uncleaned piece of ground, with an assurance that if he would cultivate it, it should not be taken from him. Some assistance was given him to fell the timber, and he accordingly began. His present account to me was as follows. I have bred a husbandman near Launceston in Cornwall. I cleared my land as well as I could, with the help afforded me. The exact limit of what ground I am to have, I do not know yet, but a certain direction has been pointed out to me, in which I may proceed as fast as I can cultivate. I have now 1.5 acres in bearded wheat, 1/2 acre in maize, and a small kitchen garden. On my wheat land I sowed 3 bushels of seed, and produced of this country broadcast 3 bushels. That's about 100 litres, so a kitchen sink. The produce of this country broadcast. I expect to reap about 12 or 13 bushels. I know nothing of the cultivation of maize, and cannot therefore guess so well at what I am likely to gather. I sowed part of my wheat in May, and part in June. That sown in May has thriven best. My maize I planted in the later end of August and the beginning of September. My land I prepared thus, having burnt the fallen timber off the ground. I dug in the ashes and then hoed it up, never doing more than 8 or perhaps 9 rods in a day, by which means it was not like the government farm, just scratched over, but properly done. Then I clod moulded it and dug in the grass and weeds. This I think almost equal to ploughing. I then let it lie as long as I could, exposed to air and sun, and just before I sowed my seed, turned it all up afresh. When I shall have reaped my crop, I purpose to hoe it again, and harrow it fine, and then sow it with turnip seed, which will mellow and prepare it for next year. My straw I mean to bury in pits, and throw in with it everything which I think will rot and turn to manure. I have no person to help me at present, but my wife, whom I married in this country. She is industrious. The governor for some time gave me the help of a convict man, but he is taken away. Both my wife and myself receive our provisions regularly at the store, like all other people. My opinion of the soil of my farm is that it is middling, neither good or bad. I will be bound to make it do with the aid of manure, but without cattle it will fail. The greatest check upon me is the dishonesty of the convicts, who, in spite of all my vigilance, rob me almost every night. November 1790. The annexed return will show the number of persons of all descriptions at Rose Hill at this period. On the morning of the 17th I went down to Sydney. Here terminates the transcription of my diary. It were vain to suppose that it can prove either agreeable or interesting to a majority of readers. But as this work is intended not only for amusement but information, I considered it right to present this detail unaltered, either in its style or arrangement. A return of the number of persons employed at Rose Hill, November 16th, 1790. A list of people, how they are employed, and the actual quantity. So there's a storekeeper, Civilian Department 1. Surgeon, there's 1. Carpenters, there's 24 men convicts. Blacksmiths, 5 men convicts. Master bricklayer, 1 men convict. Bricklayers, 28 men convicts. Master brickmaker, 1 men convict. Brickmakers, 52 men convicts. Labourers, 326 men convicts. It's got a side note. Of these labourers, 16 were sawyers. The rest are variously employed in clearing fresh land, in dragging brick and timber carts, and a great number in making a road of a mile long through the main street to the governor's house. Also, there's assistants to the provision store. There's 4 men convicts. Assistants to the hospital, 3 men convicts. Officers' servants, 6 men convicts. Making clothing, 50 women convicts. Superintendents, 4 in the civil department. A total number of persons, 552. That includes 29 troops that wasn't listed before. Total of 6 in the civil department, as listed before. 1 wife, not listed before. 3 children, not listed before. Listed before the 450 men, the convicts. The 50 women convicts. And not listed before 13 children convicts. Chapter 11. Further transactions of the colony in November 1790. During the intervals of duty, our greatest source of entertainment now lay in cultivating the acquaintance of our new friends, the natives. Ever liberal of communication, no difficulty but of understanding each other subsisted between us. Inexplicable contradictions arose to bewilder our researches, which no ingenuity could unravel, and no credulity reconcile. Bennelong, from being accustomed to our manners, and understanding a little English, was the person through whom we wished to prosecute inquiry, but he had lately become a man of so much dignity and consequence that it was not always easy to obtain his company. Clothes had been given to him at various times, but he did not always condescend to wear them. One day he would appear in them, and the next day he was to be seen carrying them in a net slung around his neck. Further to please him, a brick house of 12 feet square was built for his use, 3.6 metres squared, and for that of such of his countrymen as might choose to reside in it, on a point of land fixed upon by himself. A shield, double cased with tin, to ward off the spears of his enemies, was also presented to him by the governor. November 1790. Elated by these marks of favour, and sensible that his importance with his countrymen arose, in proportion to our patronage of him, he warmly attached himself to our society. But the gratitude of the savage is ever a precarious tenure. That of Bennelong was fated to suffer suspension, and had well nigh been obliterated by the following singular circumstance. One day the natives were observed to assemble in more than an ordinary number at their house on the point, and to be full of bustle and agitation, repeatedly calling on the name of Bennelong and that of Dean, a woman. Between 12 and 1 o'clock, Bennelong, unattended, came to the governor at his house and told him that he was going to put to death a woman immediately, whom he had brought from Botany Bay. Having communicated his intention, he was preparing to go away, seeming not to wish that the governor should be present at the performance of the ceremony. But his excellency was so struck with the fierce gestures and wild demeanour of the other, who held in his hand one of our hatchets, and frequently tried the sharpness of it, that he determined to accompany him, taking with him Mr. Collins and his orderly sergeant. On the road, Bennelong continued to talk wildly and incoherently of what he would do, and manifested such extravagant marks of fury and revenge that his hatchet was taken away from him, and a walking stick substituted for it. When they reached the house, they found several natives of both sexes lying promiscuously before the fire, and among them a young woman not more than 16 years old, who at sight of Bennelong started and raised herself half up. He no sooner saw her Then snatching a sword of the country, he ran at her and gave her 2 severe wounds on the head and 1 on the shoulder before interference in behalf of the poor wretch could be made. Our people now rushed in and seized him, but the other Indians continued quiet spectators of what was passing, either awed by Banilon's superiority or deeming it a common case, unworthy of notice and interposition. In vain did the governor by turns soothe and threaten him. In vain did the sergeant point his musket at him. He seemed dead to every passion but revenge, forgot his affection to his old friends, and instead of complying with the request they made, furiously brandished his sword at the governor, and called aloud for his hatchet to dispatch the unhappy victim of his barbarity. Matters now wore a serious aspect. The other Indians appeared under the control of Banilon, and had begun to arm and prepare their spears, as if determined to support him in his violence. November 1790. Further delay might have been attended with danger. The supply was therefore immediately hailed, and an armed boat ordered to be sent on shore. Luckily those on board the ship had already observed the commotion, and a boat was ready, into which Captain Ball, with several of his people, stepped, armed with muskets, and put off. It was reasonable to believe that so powerful a reinforcement would restore tranquillity, but Banilon stood unintimidated at disparity of numbers, and boldly demanded his prisoner, whose life, he told the governor, he was determined to sacrifice, and afterwards to cut off her head. Everyone was eager to know what could be the cause of such inveterate inhumanity. Undaunted, he replied that her father was his enemy, from whom he had received the wound in his forehead before mentioned, and that when he was down in battle and under the lance of his antagonist, this woman had contributed to assail him. She is now, added he, my property. I have ravished her by force from her tribe, and I will part with her to no person whatever, until my vengeance shall be glutted. Further remonstrance would have been wasted. His Excellency therefore ordered the woman to be taken to the hospital, in order that her wounds might be dressed. While this was doing, one of the natives, a young man named Bolodii, came up and supplicated to be taken into the boat also, saying that he was her husband, which she confirmed, and begged that he might be admitted. He was a fine, well-grown lad of 19 or 20 years old, and was one of the persons who had been in the house in the scene just described, which he had in no wise endeavoured to prevent, or to afford assistance to the poor creature who had a right to his protection. All our people now quitted the place, leaving the exasperated Banilon and his associates to meditate further schemes of vengeance. Before they parted, he gave them, however, to understand that he would follow the object of his resentment to the hospital and kill her there, a threat which the governor assured him if he offered to carry into execution, he should be immediately shot. Even this menace he treated with disdain. To place the refugees in security, a sentinel was ordered to take post at the door of the house in which they were lodged. Nevertheless, they attempted to get away in the night, either from fear that we were not able to protect them, or some apprehension of being restrained from future liberty. When questioned where they proposed to find shelter, they said they would go to the Kamaragal tribe, with whom they should be safe. On the following morning, Imi Rawanyi joined them and expressed strong fears of Banilong's resentment. Side note: this good-tempered, lively lad was become a great favourite with us, and almost constantly lived at the governor's house. He had clothes made up for him, and to amuse his mind, he was taught to wait at table. One day a lady, Mrs. MacArthur, wife of an officer of the garrison, dined there, as did Nanbury. This latter, anxious that his countrymen should appeared to advantage in his new office, gave him many instructions, strictly charging him, among other things, to take away the lady's plate whenever she should cross her knife and fork, and to give her a clean one. This Imirawanye executed, not only to Mrs. MacArthur, but to several of the other guests. At last Nanbari crossed his knife and fork with great gravity, casting a glance at the other, who looked for a moment with cool indifference at what he had done, and then turned his head another way. Stung at this supercilious treatment, he called in rage to know why he was not attended to, as well as the rest of the company. But Imirawanye only laughed, nor could all the anger and reproaches of the other prevail upon him to do that for one of his own countrymen, which he cheerfully continued to perform to every other person. Soon after, a party of natives, known to consist of Bennelong's chosen friends, with a man of the name of Bigon at their head, boldly entered the hospital garden and tried to carry off all three by force. They were driven back and threatened, to which their leader only replied by contemptuous insolence. Bennelong, finding he could not succeed, withdrew himself for 2 days. At length he made his appearance, attended only by his wife. Unmindful of what had so recently happened, he marched singly up to the governor's house, and on being refused admittance, though unarmed, attempted to force the sentinel. The soldier spared him, but the guard was instantly sent for, and drawn up in front of the house. Not that their cooperation was necessary, but their appearance mighty terrify. His ardour now cooled, and he seemed willing, by submission, to atone for his misconduct. His intrepid disregard for personal risk, nay, of life, could not, however, but gain admiration, though it led us to predict that this Bennelong, whom imagination had fondly pictured, like a second Omai, the gaze of a court and the scrutiny of the curious, would perish untimely, the victim of his own temerity. To encourage his present disposition of mind, and to try if feelings of compassion towards an enemy could be exerted by an Indian warrior, the governor ordered him to be taken to the hospital, that he might see the victim of his ferocity. He complied in sullen silence. When about to enter the room in which she lay, he appeared to have a momentary struggle with himself, which ended his resentment. He spoke to her with kindness, and professed sorrow for what he had done, and promised her future protection. Barangaroo, who had accompanied him, now took the alarm, and as in shunning one extreme we are ever likely to rush into another, she thought him perhaps too courteous and tender. Accordingly, she began to revile them both with great bitterness, threw stones at the girl, and attempted to beat her with a club. November 1790. Here terminated this curious history, which I leave to the reader's speculation. Whether human sacrifices of prisoners be common among them is a point, which all our future inquiry never completely determined. It is certain that no second instance of this sort was ever witnessed by us.
It's the chapters 8 to 11 of the book called A Complete Account of the Settlement at Port Jackson by Watkin Tench. Please join me next time when I read through chapters 12 to 15. Until next time, I wish you well.